أولى ثانوي، فرصة جديدة وحلم جديد وهنعديها بالتأكيد، وهنعديها بالتأكيد. أولى ثانوي.
أهلا بكم طلبات الصف الأول الثانوي على قناة مدرستنا تحت إشراف وزارة التربية والتعليم. Today inshallah we will start studying unit 2 chapter 1 which is talk about the motion, and let's see what we will talk about today. As you see in unit 1, this is for today, we will talk about the motion and specifically the motion in a straight line. First we have some objective of this lesson and what you should be able to do or understand after studying this lesson. First we will define the concept of the motion in a straight line, and then we will know or talk about the types of motion, because of course not all the object moves with the same way or in the same manner. Then we will plot and explain the graph that represented the velocity or the change in the position of the object by time, which represents the velocity. Then you will be able to differentiate and compare between the type of velocity. First, we should know, if I ask you a question, what is the meaning of motion, or what's meant by a moving object? If you look or see in this on the slide, you may note some moving object, just like the train or the persons, they are moves. And by noting the behavior of the person or the train, we will define that we can call them a moving object, which means they change their position with the flow of time. So the definition of the motion is, this is the change in the position of the object or of the body by flowing the time. But as you see in the video, the train and the persons, they don't move in the same way or with the same manner, which means we have two types, or we can classify the motion of the object in two types. First one, which is a translational motion, and the second type is a periodic motion. Translational motion, by its name, when you see all of these objects, this boy and the moving of the ball or the moving ball, just like the car sliding on the road and the train, or even the person in the same row, just like as you see. All of these motion, we call them, it's translational motion, which means the motion has a starting point and end point. And this is the definition of the translational motion. We have the object moves from a definite point, and they have a target or a destination to reach to. So when we get a motion with a starting point and end point, we call it a translational motion. When you see the other type of motion, which is a periodic motion, periodic motion is defined as the motion that repeats itself in interval or equal interval of time. Just like as you see rotating desk or the swing or jumping on the road, and as you see the screwdriver, all of these are, we call them a periodic motion, which means the motion repeats itself in equal interval of time. هتلاقي الحركة بتكرر نفسها مع مرور الوقت، بس مش في أي وقت وخلاص، لا. The same motion is repeated in the same interval of time. بتكرر نفسها في نفس الفترة الزمنية الموجودة عندي. This is what we call a periodic motion, just like a circular motion, or rotating the earth around the sun, or rotating the moon around the earth. As we have a very frequent type of motion or example, that is the motion of the pendulum, اللي هو حركة البندول، اللي هي الساعات القديمة اللي كانت بتبقى كده معمولة ونازل منها البندولم ده وبيتحرك رايح جاي. It rotates around or repeats its motion around a a point or position of equilibrium. And these are time. This is just a little exercise that we just to try to classify the type of motion. The clock pendulum with projectile trains and the plunge of the turning fork. Clock pendulum, what do you think about the type of motion of this pendulum? And the projectile هي أي حاجة بنحذفها اللي هي المقذوفات، بنحذف كورة، بنحذف قلم، whatever, even البوز. Clock pendulum, it's classified as a periodic motion. A projectile, it's a translational motion, of course. Will train translational too, and the vibration of the turning fork, it's a periodic motion. اللي هي التانينج فورك لو تفتكروا اللي هي الشوكة الرنانة اللي كنا بناخدها زمان في اللاب واحنا صغيرين. كنا بنعمل الاكتيفيتيز بتاعت الفويس بتاعت الصوت. طيب, just to describe the motion of an object, we need just to know or describe some of properties of this object during its motion. The most important or the most effective one is the velocity or the concept of velocity. Velocity that means اللي هي السرعة. تمام, احنا الفيلوسيتي احنا متعودين اي object طالما بيتحرك يبقى اكيد هو ليه specific velocity او ليه سرعة معينة. What is the meaning of the velocity? ايه المقصود بقى بالفيلوسيتي اللي احنا بنتكلم عنها دي؟ الفيلوسيتي it's a vector physical quantity, which means it has a direction and magnitude, of course. So a rate of a change of the displacement and of the object during its motion, it's called the velocity. احنا قلنا ان اي moving object, which means it changes the position, its position by the time. So the rate of a change of its position during or by the time, this is called the velocity of the object. So velocity as a symbol, it's LV equal a change in displacement of the object divided by the time of a change or divided by the time of motion. And which is equal delta V over change in T. والmeasuring unit طبعا of course بتاعت velocity it's meter per second or a kilometer per hour لو احنا بنتكلم عن مسافات كبيرة أو عن object تانية. Just to represent the relation between the displacement covered by the object and the time, and we trace it just like displacement on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis. We get a straight line, and this straight line, the slope of this line represents the change in displacement over the time, which is equal, of course, the velocity of the motion. So when we plot a graph just like this, displacement on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis, and we get a straight line just like this, we get the value of the slope, which is equal the velocity, and it's of course it's a constant magnitude, which means that the object moves with a constant speed or constant velocity. As I have just said, I said speed, and this is wrong, because if we represent this displacement with time, the slope doesn't represent the speed, it represents the velocity of the object. Because we have a misconception or a misunderstanding between two concepts, which is speed and velocity. Speed, the distance covered by the object during the motion, and it is scalar, and it's defined by magnitude only. المسافة هي عبارة عن length of the path, as we explained in the prior episode. We have a difference between distance and displacement. Speed, it's related to the total covered distance by time, and this is called the speed. And of course, it's always positive, because all the time or during the motion, the object should cover a definite distance. But the velocity, it's something else. It's related to the displacement or the rate of a change of displacement of the object, which means velocity equal the displacement of the object per unit time or per second, which means a change in displacement by the change of time. Of course, it's a vector, which means it's defined by its magnitude and its direction. It's not enough just to find the value of the velocity, but you have to definite the direction of velocity. It's positive in some times and it's negative in other situations, other cases. Type of velocity, as we said, we have many types of velocity, just like uniform velocity. Uniform velocity, which means the object covered or makes equal displacement in equal interval of times, which means delta v over delta t, all the path of the motion, it's equal. And in this case, as you see, if the object starts its motion from 0 meter, after 2 seconds it covered 4 meter, and in the next second covered another 4 meter, till the end of the motion. You will see it makes equal displacement in equal interval of times. When we divide delta d over delta t, we get a constant value, which means the object moves with a constant velocity. But in other cases, when you find the object covers unequal displacement in equal intervals of time, you find all the time the ratio between delta d over delta t, it's a variable, it's not the same. And in this case, we call the object moves with a variable or non-uniform velocity. When we represent the graph between a displacement and the time for the uniform velocity, of course, as we said before or mentioned before, we get a straight line, just like this. You get a straight line when we represent the relation between distance or displacement with time. Of course, it's a straight line, which means it's a constant, because the slope here is a constant value, which represents the value of the velocity of motion. But when we represent distance or displacement and the relation with time, and we get a curve just like this, which means the slope of this curve, it's not constant, all the path of the motion of the object, which means the object moves with ununiform or non-uniform or a variable velocity of motion. It's not constant all the path of the work. This makes us to, or leads us to another concept, which is called instantaneous velocity, اللي هي السرعة اللحظية, which means this is the velocity or the value of velocity at a given instant. عند لحظة معينة أو عند نقطة معينة or specific time, we can find or calculate the velocity of the object at this moment. طب هنجيبها ازاي دي بقى؟ طب احنا طبعا it's represented by a curve. We just note a point on the curve and then we draw a tangent for this point and we get a straight line. And when we find the slope of this straight line, we get the value of the instantaneous value of the object at this point, which represents instantaneous velocity, which is equal change of displacement over the change of time. We have the average velocity. Average velocity, which means the total over total. We talk about velocity, which means displacement over total time. So when we find the average velocity of a moving object with this curve, we have to get the total displacement. And how, if you remember from the prior episode, the total displacement is a straight line between the starting point to the end point of the motion. So we relay the first point or the starting point to the end point, we get a straight line just like this, which represents the total displacement of the object. We divided total displacement over the total time. How can we get the total time from the graph? From the maximum point of the time on the x-axis during the motion of the object. We find the length of the displacement over the total time of the motion, we get the average velocity. To find the average speed, as we said, we have velocity and speed, so we have average velocity, so we have average speed. And I think if I ask you how can we get to the average speed, I think all of you will answer it. Speed, which means distance over total time. So average speed, which is equal to the ratio between the total covered distance by the object over the total time of the motion. This is a little example just to understand what we have taken together. The opposite figure showed the path of a moving car. We have a car starting from this point, 10 kilometers, then 5 kilometers, then 10 kilometers, then another 5 kilometers. The car makes or made this motion in half an hour. في نص ساعة عملت لي كل الكلام ده. طيب عاوز ايه بقى؟ هنا find the average speed. Average speed, which means the relation or the ratio between the total covered distance of the object over the total time. But we don't have directly the total distance that the car moves. Okay, but we have a total time. We can add all these displacements together to find the total distance, because by the definition of distance is the length of the path of the motion. طب هو فين ال path of motion عندي؟ مشيت كده وكده وكده وكده. تمام؟ فهنجمع we will add the whole distance that we have 10 plus 5 plus 10 plus 5, which is equal 30. This is the total distance over the total time, which is half an hour. 30 over half an hour, which is equal 60 meters per second. I think it's too easy to do. If we do it together, so but عندي هنا ال v, which is equal a total distance over a total time. Total distance, as we said before, which is equal 30 meter or 30 kilometer over half, which is equal 0.5. All of this which is equal 60 kilometer per hour. And this is the average speed. This is the average speed for this object. And this is, I think this is the type of motion which is we talked about. If we have at the first a graph distance, or we plot the graph between the relation between distance and time. Of course, if we get this straight line, just like this, which means it's a static object, which means it's not moving object. How can we find it's not a moving object? By two things. From reading the graph, what represents the slope of this in the graph in general between a distance or displacement and time? It represents the velocity. And the value of the slope of this line is equal 0. So, which means object moves with velocity equal 0, which means it's a static object. It's not moving or a non-moving object. From something else, when we find or follow the increasing of time, we will find the displacement of the object or the distance covered by the object at the same value. يعني كل ما الوقت بيمر عندي الobject الposition بتاعته still constant, واقف عند the same position, which means it's a static object or non-moving object. And this is a graph that represents the motion of object with a uniform velocity, because it's a straight line and with a constant slope, and this is a variable or non-uniform, and this is another time. And the fourth graph, this is represented to non-uniform motion of object, but when its speed is speed up or decrease or slow down. And now let's go just have a summarize or a little summarize for what we have taken or studied today on the lightboard. Okay, let's go. In this lesson, we have taken or told about the definition of the motion, and we defined the motion, which is the change in the position with the object with the flow of the time. And we take the related concept to the motion, which is the velocity, which is defined by the rate of change of the displacement of the object by the time. V, which is equal delta D over delta T. And we represent the relation of this displacement by meter or time by second on the x-axis. We get some curves. A curve which make a straight line that represents a constant velocity, which means the object makes a equal displacement in the same equal interval of time. But the velocity of the moving object, it's not always constant, and sometimes we have to change the velocity of the motion. In this case, we call it a variable velocity, which is represented by a curve. If we represent two, a displacement will time by second on the x-axis, we get a curve in this way. From this curve, we can find a new concept which is called instantaneous velocity, which means the velocity of the moving object at a specific instant. For example, when we want just to find the velocity of the motion of object at this point, we just determine the point on the graph and just draw a tangent for this point, and we get the slope of this point. And the slope in this case will represent the value of the instantaneous velocity at this moment. We have another concept which is called average speed. Average speed, which is represent a total distance over the total time. And of course, it had the same measuring unit as all the velocity that we have, which meter per second. We have another concept which is average velocity, which is equal to total displacement for the moving object over the total time. It's also by meter per second. And we talked also about the motion during the definition of the motion, and we said this is a change in the position of the moving object or of any body by the flow of the time. And we said we have many types of motion, just like transitional motion, as our motion or our moving in the street or the train, the plane, whatever. And we have another type of motion which is a periodic motion, and we said this is a motion that repeats itself frequently with time or in equal interval of times, just like the rotation of the earth around the sun or the rotation of the moon around the earth. This is for this session or for this episode, and this is what we have taken as a summarize. I hope it's useful for you. Thank you. Thanks for your watching. I'll see you next time, inshallah. My dear student, this is all for today. I hope it's useful and it was interesting, as I promised you at the first or at the beginning of the episode. Thanks for being users for today, and this is all, and I hope you have a very great day. Thank you and see you next time, inshallah.
أولى ثانوي فرصة جديدة وحلم جديد وهنعديها بالتأكيد.